Good afternoon, Ann.
Hi, Mark.
How are you today?
I'm doing just great. How are you?
Very good, very good. Now, I noticed I watched your video, your vlog yesterday, and you told people not to look at your house.
I showed
So
them my house.
is that what people are looking at right now, or are you in your
No,
office?
they're looking at my office. They're seeing the wall of books behind me.
Okay, okay.
It's it's very unintimate right now. But if you
Right,
go to the blog, you can get a glimpse of my house.
It was very revealing. There's a wall of books behind me, but they are the budgets from many decades past. Which do not actually belong to me. And I noticed you're a rock star now as well.
I am?
An inadvertent rock star?
In what sense?
Isn't there a Madison indie band that has used your
right. I have a
used your
former
voice?
student. His name's Trent Jobson, and he has a band called Cougar. And they have some kind of like post-rock, jazz-inspired whatever. I don't know, but all I know is that he recorded a lecture I did many years ago in federal jurisdiction, and then used the sampling of my voice as part. And so when they perform, there's like my recorded voice comes out. But
right.
I don't perform on stage, and I can't sing.
And you're getting royalties out of this or anything?
No. What am I going to do? Sue my former student? It would take a lot before I would crunch down.
Put to the test how good a student he was. Can he handle a tough IP case?
I don't know, but I like the music, and I sort of think that they're giving me kind of, they're lending me a kind of an aura of coolness by being having my voice used. So,
right.
So I have to. I'm getting something out of the deal. Don't you think it's a fair exchange?
I think it's a fair exchange.
All they did was steal my voice.
Right. Who steals my voice steals
my soul.
Steals nothing. Yeah. So if you were getting royalties, let's say massive. The song becomes a big hit. You get massive royalties. You become incredibly wealthy. You would not say it's through much effort of your own, right? Other than doing your job as a law professor.
Well, what about my years of effort of going to law school? All the expense I put into this. All
That's
the effort
possible.
that I've built into my persona and developing this sampleable
But this
voice.
brings me to the first thing that I want to talk about today. There was an op-ed in the Times, New York Times, last week by Tyler Cowen of the Marginal Revolution blog, and I think he teaches George Mason, I think,
Right.
Arguing that inequality doesn't really matter, and he had a number of ways of talking about how inequality matters. It doesn't really matter. Some of which are fine, some of which aren't. But the thing that totally got my back up, and because it's a little crusade that I've had for a long time, is the idea that people who make scads of money in our society do so because they work harder than other people. And I just think my view of this, what I wrote on the American Prospect blog, Tapped, is that we can accept a certain level of inequality. We have to accept a certain level of inequality as the price of a dynamic economy. I mean, unless you really want to go to a level of socialism that I don't. I don't want to make eliminating inequality the goal or anything like that. It is an inevitable result of capitalist economy that's productive and grows, and that's something we need. So I can live with some equality. And one of the problems I have with the whole inequality frame is that there's not a clear standard of what your goal is. Once your goal is not zero, I think that's a limit to it. But it drives me crazy to suggest that people who make 100 times more than the median income or something like that actually do so because they work that much harder. And
well, they can't possibly work 100 times.
You can't possibly work 100 times. Nobody, you take the hardest working person and the least hardworking full-time employed person, and the disparity. It can seem staggering because people really do seem to be pushing. Some people really do push themselves to the limit. Some of them actually do get rewarded for that, and some don't. But the hardest working person does kind of work awfully hard, but that's still maybe at best twice as hard as a relative slacker. And of course, nobody works harder than those people who are trying to raise a family on the minimum wage, often live very far from where their job is, have absolutely no control over their working day or anything else. I mean, some of the better paid people in this country, they may work a lot. They may go home and work at home. I work. I don't know how many hours I work. I don't even separate work from non-work anymore. But I do a few hours every night. But in exchange, I have enormous control over my work day. If I just, when we're done with this thing, I'm just going to declare I got to go pick up my daughter, that kind of thing. total control.
I'm thinking about, I have a lot of contact with people who work in law firms who just lose control of their entire life. They work very hard, they make a huge investment in their education, they take a job, and at that point it's like they've given their entire soul to the firm. They can't control the hours. They couldn't work 9 to 5 and walk out without looking awful.
That's right.
As far as just multiplying it, well, you have a limited amount of time in your life. If you work twice as long, if you work double, if one person works 8 hours, another person works 16 hours, it's not just twice as much. Otherwise, why would we pay overtime is at a higher rate? So when you go into the extra hours, it should count for more because you're giving the last portion of your life to the job. So you can't just do simple multiples like that, can you?
No, you can't. Obviously, those other hours are there. I mean, law firms are the one, and the great white collar sweatshop.
Right.
And lawyers are compensated for it, although they're compensated more later on. And then, of course, I've seen the phenomenon of people at law firms in New York working very hard, making a lot of money, and looking with incredible envy at the investment bankers who work half as hard and make 30 times as much money. So I mean, there are these idiosyncrasies at all levels of the economy.
Now, on what level are you asking us to be concerned about this? You're not really saying we should do anything about it. You're just disagreeing with Tyler Cowen, who is saying don't worry at all, and that we shouldn't feel any sense of envy or injustice at all. I mean, so what are you saying, that in fact we ought to be mad, or there's not really anything to do here, is there? Well,
no, I think we ought to be. I think we ought to be concerned about inequality. I think we can have a disagreement. We can have as Senator Clinton would say, a national debate about inequality. But in order to have that on honest terms, we need to strip the debate of this concept, which you hear all over, that assumes that people who make $5 million a year do so because they really work harder than the average person. And I think some do, some don't. I just think that's a concept that automatically introduces a kind of sense of virtue into inequality. And I think inequality is inequality is not immoral. It's a kind of amoral fact of capitalism. And, as a policy matter, what I would say is you do need to be concerned about it. You need to be concerned about it rising. You need to be concerned about the consequences for capitalism, as well as for justice, of it reaching its current level.
About it. I mean, you just want us to be concerned, or do you want us to do something?
No. I want us to say, if there are reasons in the economy that are leading, for one reason or another, to these tremendous returns to capital, which result in tremendous levels of inequality, I want public policy to be a countervailing force on that. I want public policy to not exacerbate it as it does now, so that when you have lower tax rates on capital gains and dividends, you're exacerbating the degree to which owning capital pays off.
So you're saying there should be a redistribution of wealth. There should be active redistribution of wealth.
I'm saying that before you even have a conversation about active redistribution of wealth, you should get to the point where public policy is not making the distribution of wealth worse in the same direction in the direction that inequality is going.
I guess I would have some objection to this idea of calling it inequality. I mean, if the idea is everybody can compete for jobs and try to get the jobs that they want, some people will have a better job than you, some people will make more money than you. This idea that if other people make more money, I'm being treated unequally, I don't know if I would buy into that. I mean, I think that that's trying to make a justice issue out of something that might not be a justice issue.
Well, you may or may not be treated unequally if you're competing in the same market and under the same rules, and there isn't invidious discrimination. The result is significantly unequal, and we've got public policy that's encouraging that and exacerbating that. And I think we can turn the direction of public policy around before you're dramatically redistributing anything. If everybody, for example, if you simply said everybody pays the same tax, whether their income comes from, sitting around collecting capital gains and dividends, or going to a job every day and collecting wages, everybody pays the same level of tax. And then you think about the payroll tax and the fact that that only actually impacts the first $80,000 of income or so forth. So say, okay, let's break those two things down so that, so that people are treated equally regardless of how much money, regardless of where their money comes from, they're treated equally. You would actually have a significant impact on inequality while actually operating from a totally neutral principle.
Well, I think there's a difference between whether public policy is causing some people to have more money than others, or whether you're just seeing public policy as trying to cure a situation that occurred without the policy being there.
Well, I think there's, and you can see this in comparing, for example, before and after, income inequality before tax and transfers and after tax and transfers, and you could, and the difference has changed significantly. I mean, we are taking less proportionately from the rich than we used to. And it would be easy to fix with some basically neutral principles without even really worrying about who's rich and who you're taking it away from and so forth.
Well, I'm not going to offer any expert opinions on tax policy, but I think if the key question at heart here is how upset should people be? How much of a sense of outrage should people feel about the disparities? And it seems to me Tyler Cohen was working the line of saying you shouldn't be outraged at all, you should accept it.
Right. And do you agree with that? Is that where you are?
I think maybe he's overdoing it, but I don't think I would go as far as you would. I mean, I think people make different amounts of money because the market works in a certain way, and there's some things a lot of people don't want to do. Some people who make less because they didn't make an investment in their education at an earlier point, or because they wanted a 9-to-5 job that they could walk out of at 5 and leave behind. There's just a lot of different forces here, a lot of considerations, and I think to just compare the numbers and see that some people make an awful lot of money is, I don't know that I would structure public policy around that.
Right.
I don't know that I'm that outraged by it.
Right. Some people who, to some degree, there's also an argument that when you focus on inequality and on the disparity that's really actually, I mean, the real disparity is that top 1% that's just running away, and some people focus on the disparity between Cowan used the example of the person who's making $500,000 versus the person who's making $50,000. Some people focus on that level of inequality, and that's partly a political argument to get to a broad middle class constituency. That say you're all kind of screwed by those people who are making, not even $500,000, are making $2 million, $3 million, $4 million a year. That's one way of looking at it. And then the other way, I tend to say above a certain level, I'm not actually concerned about inequality. I don't care how much more Bill Gates makes than the average, senior project manager at Microsoft, let's say. But I am concerned at the very low end, and I don't think that all has to do with choices people have made.
I don't think it's all about
with the structure of the economy and the fact that they are powerless to operate either through unions or through government to be better compensated.
Well, how do you think this is going to play a role in the coming presidential election? I noticed that when Hillary Clinton made her announcement that she was running, that she tried to kind of play it kind of carefully to say that she was that she was concerned about the sort of basic bargain that America had with people. Do you remember that there was kind of a sense that people, not wanting to trigger the usual, the Democrats might in a major way redistribute the wealth, or they're going to soak the rich, or something like that. But she emphasized this idea that ordinary people work hard, and they're the ones that deserve the attention of government. And the implication was just sort of, there's some rich people off there that you should be worried that they're getting too much, that too much policy is shaped for them, and that we need to refocus things on the hardworking people who really deserve better treatment. It's sort of something that's, sounding traditional themes without creating the traditional alarm about what liberals might do.
Right. Well, I mean, and it was very Clinton-esque. I mean, it was really, there were two wonderful themes in '92 in the first Clinton campaigns, and in the first year. One, which was very public, was the idea that the phrase, if you work hard and play by the rules, you should get ahead. I mean, there was an implicit sense of a kind of social contract here, and I've been doing a lot of work on this sort of implicit social contract. It's an interesting phrase. It's never clear exactly what playing by the rules really means, but
And how badly are you going to treat the people who don't play by the rules? I mean, there are a lot of people who've, violated some of those rules, who have committed crimes or have done one thing or another. People, illegal immigrants would be another group of people who aren't really playing by the rules, but you might not want to give them nothing.
That's right.
This
that's
idea
right.
that we're for this central group of people who do all the right things, but somehow just don't get enough money for it. And I think that's a very narrow focus, and it leaves a lot of people out.
Well, it may leave a lot of people out, but it's one of those phrases that makes everybody think you're talking about them.
Right.
Whereas John Edwards is a little more explicit with Two Americas. I mean, he's not totally explicit, but I mean, he's a little clearer that, it's not really a few bad apples over there and then everybody else. It's really a distinction, and I know I'm not in. I know which America I'm in. I have no illusion about that. With Senator Clinton, you don't quite. You have a sense
Edwards is really trying to play a more left-wing sounding, class warfare. It's open to the charge that it's class warfare, and a lot of people will be turned off by that. And she's more precisely fine-tuned. I mean, she could scarcely say the word middle more frequently.
Right. But I don't understand. I hate the word class warfare for a number of reasons. But one is, in a sense, Edwards' focus, if you have a focus on poverty and the people who are really, really left out of the American dream, which is not, in fact, everybody. Mm-hmm. It is 20%, or it's somewhere between 20 and 40% that have really had a hard time getting ahead, that have significantly less economic security, that do not have health care, who need help. You can basically say we're going to have a reasonable, fair tax system. We're not going to punish anybody. Capitalism will continue to do the great things that it does, and it's not about tearing down the rich. It is about setting a basic standard of what we think as a society people who work should get, and potentially people who don't work should be able to live out. I mean, classic a Nixon administration concept. I don't think he'd even go nearly as far as say a guaranteed minimum income or anything like that. I don't think that's class warfare. I don't think that needs to be class warfare.
No, I'm not myself using that word, but that phrase. I'm just saying that if you speak a certain way when you're a Democrat, you're going to cause your opponents to accuse you of engaging in class warfare. That Edwards is framing his campaign in a way that opens himself up to that. He's doing it deliberately. That's his niche. That he actually to say Two Americas is to pit one side against the other. Hillary is clearly not doing that. She's clearly trying to avoid anyone being able to charge her with that. So she's very carefully trying to put herself in the middle the way Bill Clinton did.
Right, and it's a very focus group tested bit of language. Now, of course, my response to that, if somebody asked, either of these campaigns asked me what to do, my response would be, they're going to accuse you of class warfare, whatever you say. They're going to accuse you of going to a school in a madrasa, whatever you say. You're going to accuse you of being soft on terrorism, whatever you say. So you might as well say the right thing. You might as well say what you believe. You might as well talk about the problems of this country in a way that you can actually say those things from your own heart.
There are very few people actually talking about poverty and real underclass.
Yeah.
Or there's just a lot of denial that it even matters. Everyone wants to hear, what are you going to do for me? I mean, the Democrats have been doing that for a long time, just sort of offering what they're going to do for people who actually sound reasonably well off.
Exactly. And it's related to the view that, poor people are either they're not going to vote or they're going to vote Democratic anyway, so that those aren't the swing voters that you need to reach. So you need to talk to the extent you talk about economic issues, you've got to talk to relatively well-off swing voters, as opposed to putting forth a little more of an actual moral vision. Yeah. And as a result, you have a real absence of that. Well, speaking of swing voters. One of the interesting things to me about Hillary Clinton has always been the argument, and this is really promoted by Mark Penn, the pollster, who's basically argued that elections are decided by swing voters who are basically middle class white women, the soccer moms that he invented, and that the secret of Hillary Clinton is in her appeal to that group. And obviously she is once again speaking that language. yesterday in the Washington Post, Linda Hirschman, who's written some interesting stuff about young women and careers and sort of in a sense bring back a kind of older line, first wave, or I guess the second wave feminist perspective to the debate, had a piece basically. I mean, you wrote about. We both read it. You wrote about it already, so maybe you can characterize it a little bit more. Trying to actually assess how women felt about Hillary Clinton.
Well, she did what she admitted wasn't very scientific research.
Right.
It seems to be she just called up a few women in Washington and asked them how much they followed the news, and then she really kind of ran them down for not being more interested in the news, not like men.
Right.
That men will follow the details of political news, and women, those women, it doesn't sound very feminist to me, but those women, they're going to just act on their, here's a quote, women don't decide elections because they're not rational political actors.
Right.
They vote on impulse and on elusive factors such as personality. I mean, it's... I ended up saying something like, geez, she's practically convincing us that women shouldn't have the vote. And one of my commenters said something like, this sounds like the debate they had back at the time women were given the vote. We can't really trust women to vote. They're really mushy-headed. They don't follow the news, and they just go on their intuition. Somehow this counts as feminism. I'm not really sure why.
Yeah. Well, it was wrong. I thought it was wrong on about 16 different levels. One being, of course, women in the Washington, D.C. area are not really where the election's going to be decided either, number one. It's more in where you live, but even there, it's probably not in Madison.
Probably not Madison, but Wisconsin and in a swing state.
You are in a what it still counts as a swing state. You might lose that status eventually. So it was, that was sort of just a practical error. The idea that men decide things rationally because they read Newsweek and things like that, falls apart on when you look at the number of men who get obsessed with John McCain without the slightest regard to actually what
also,
John McCain stands for and doesn't.
Interested in the election in 2008 now. I don't think that's
that's another
thing. I think
thing.
this whole political news junkie thing is just as emotional as having an aversion to the political news.
That's absolutely right, and it leaves you with a real lack of awareness of if you forget that most people think of politics. I think there's a Joseph Schumpeter quote, something like as something that rises to slightly below the level of interest of a hobby for most people. Even at election time, if you forget that, you're inherently out of tune with where people are, and of course that's the swing voter concept. That's the idea is that they're people who aren't very engaged. But I mean, I think men go more nuts in their sort of gut reaction to who's authentic, who's not authentic, and stuff like that. And it's men who are obsessed with the pantsuit, the not pantsuit, the Nancy Pelosi wears this, Nancy Pelosi wears that. It's not women who are driving that thing. It was outrageous on that level. It was also upsetting on the third level, which is something actually there was a number of people on Tapped wrote about last week, and I jumped on too, which is this. The worst, the liberal conviction that if only everybody, if only we had a national conversation and everybody, had the right information and they all read this and that, then we would, and they didn't listen to bad demagogues like Jerry Falwell or whatever, then we would, we'd have a better country and liberalism would prevail, which seems to me a kind of, if you're serious about a national conversation and deliberation, the first thing you need to do is take people seriously in terms of where they are.
And this whole thing of a national conversation, I mean, in the Hillary Clinton campaign, it seems to me that that's just another effort to appeal to people's emotions and to give people just sort of a sense that they're being heard. It's not really listening to them, so I don't really see how anything much is going on there other than an appeal to emotions. Do one thing that drove me crazy about Linda Hirschman's article was that she was saying that Hillary, to get women's votes, she actually ought to act all Oprah-esque, and this is a quote from the article, she has had the soap opera story of the century with that charismatic, faithless husband. This has made her suffer something, that women might see as a reason to support her. And if she was willing to open the old wound to convince potential female supporters that her policies such as universal child health care arise out of her concern for women like that, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, as if she should go portraying herself as deserving to be president because her husband cheated on her and because she's been a wronged woman. That doesn't make any sense at all. First of all, I think a lot of women would turn that against her if they were making personal decisions, but also it just would seem wildly unpresidential to start telling us melodramatic story of yourself.
Right. Well, you also don't need to tell it. I mean, it is a story we all already know, and I think, I do in theory, it is for somebody who is often perceived as somewhat aloof and distant and hard to connect with, the fact that she's had this experience, which is an experience that many women have had. I mean, few women have had, entirely untroubled lives, and that few anybody has had entirely untroubled lives in that respect. And to understand the choices that people make in a challenge and the decision to stay married in those circumstances could be something that people could relate to for somebody who they normally have trouble relating to. But you don't need to bring it up in order to have that come across. And in fact, her views about child care and things like that don't derive from that experience.
And people don't think she stayed with her husband because she's a fragile or especially sensitive woman. People just suspect that she stayed with him because it was an ambitious thing to do. It was just a way of trying to get to power.
Well, I mean that may be, or she may have stayed with him. I mean, they have clearly a very, very deep bond, and which has survived many challenges, as in fact strong marriages do. I don't want to get into
assumptions there. I think people who are a little dubious about her don't necessarily assume that they stayed together because of their deep, personal bond and that they have a strong marriage. It seems like a kind of a political alliance that is crafty in a way that's different from normal marriages. For her to say, "Oh, look, I'm a troubled woman who understands marriages like yours," I just don't think people believe that. But can I raise another question?
But we don't need to argue about that. I mean, the fact is she doesn't need to make an emotional appeal in either direction about that to any kind of voters. And the fact is, I don't think there's any evidence yet that women of Mark Penn's assertion, which she was kind of directly responding to, that women do have any particularly greater bond with Hillary Clinton than they do with other politicians who have a gender gap in their behalf. I mean, Bill Clinton had the biggest gender gap was Bill Clinton in '96, certainly. But in general, I mean, there's going to be a gender gap, and I don't think she's going to have a greater one, especially a greater one that's in her favor. That is where the advantage among women offsets the disadvantage among men.
I think the assumption that women like other women and feel a special bond to other women, I don't think that that's so true. I think women may have felt bonded to Bill Clinton. They liked him for a lot of reasons, that he was charismatic. To like her, I don't know that necessarily follows. It seems to me it might just as likely follow that people think that she's not the right kind of woman, or she's not a proper woman. She doesn't. But I don't think women necessarily like other women that much anyway. I don't think Linda Hirschman seems to like other women very much.
She does not seem to like other women, and she really seems to have crossed a line from trying to revive a kind of feminism into a kind of scolding. You're not doing the right thing. You're staying at home, and you're not reading news magazines, and you're not doing this, and you're not doing that, which is, I don't know. At some point, people do have to be allowed to make their own choices. These aren't easy choices for any woman.
Can I just raise a real problem that I have with Hillary Clinton? I was watching her do this town hall meeting in Des Moines yesterday, and it really made me worry that she has a terrible problem as a woman running for president and calling attention to that and trying to make something special out of that. I mean, it seems to me everyone knows she's a woman. She's obviously a woman. She should just allow that to happen. She's a woman that has whatever appeal it has. But if she plays this woman theme, as she did right from the start, saying, a woman can win the presidency, as if we should prove that we could elect a woman president by electing her, I think that's already starting to backfire. I was really troubled by the way when she opened it up to questions at that town meeting, that I think every single question was on some kind of a woman's theme, including things that just were just fluff, like, could a woman be president? Well, what is she going to say? Right. And a doctor asked her the question, what is she going to do about obesity and diabetes? And I just thought, she's just getting mired in these women's themes. It doesn't, it's not convincing me that she should be president, and I feel like people are disrespecting her as if she's just some novelty, like, oh, look, a woman is running for president. Now we can talk about children and education and health care all the time. I just think that that's, at some point, it should backfire if that's all she's going to do.
Right. I think I agree with that. I mean, you don't have to, you don't have to say it. I think it is probably relying a little too much on this, on this Mark Penn theory that you're running as a woman because you're running to women, that you're speaking to women. I mean, there's no way around. I mean, everybody's got a certain curiosity, I think, about the question of whether women maybe govern differently than men, whether there's a particularly different appeal. I mean, it is remarkable. I always think about this. I went to work in the United States Senate in 1990 for Bill Bradley. There were 2 women senators at that time. It's only 16 years ago, and now there are 17, something like that. Enormous number of women governors. But at the time when Hillary Clinton set out to kind of remodel the idea of what it was to be the first lady, or what we'll soon be calling the president's spouse at some point in the future. It was the women in the real breakthrough of women in politics had not happened yet at all. And so they're still playing from the idea that it's a bit of a novelty, but the fact is it's a bit, it's Governor Sebelius in Kansas, and Jenna Napolitano in Arizona, and Amy Klobuchar in Minnesota, just elected to the Senate. I mean, these folks are, they don't do they have whatever characteristics they bring, and they're not playing the women card very hard, except that it's inherently a part of who they are. I mean, it's part of the deal, but it's not novel. The novelty aspect of it isn't part of the deal, but it's still a novelty that, I mean, we haven't had a serious women candidate for the presidency. That's a weird thing that we haven't.
Well, the fact is she is a former first lady, and she used being the wife of a president to get where she is. From my perspective, the thrill of having a woman get to be president is, severely undermined by the fact that this is a former first lady who used a man to leverage her career. It doesn't exactly thrill my feminist soul to see that. I don't think, I wish she would downplay it and just be the individual that she is, and not try to get a lot of credit for being a woman, because the fact is she used a man to get as far as she did.
Well, I mean, she may have used a man for certain things. She got herself elected to the Senate from New York with, I mean, to me, that's the great miracle. You come into this state, which is not where you've lived. 48% of the people are not going to vote for you under any circumstances, and you get 53% of the vote. And then you do actually an incredible job, and you get overwhelmingly reelected. I mean, that's her own. That's her own, entirely her achievement. And she's entitled to it. So I don't want to. I'm not going to.
Well, she's as entitled as some of these other senators. They all seem to think they're qualified.
Oh, yeah.
She's getting extra credit by this reflected charisma of Bill Clinton.
Well, reflected charisma and the fact that the sense that she was at that level of power, and that was a partnership.
Well, is she going to use that? Is she going to say, when she actually starts talking about some subjects that are relevant to the presidency, when she actually starts talking about foreign affairs and national security, is she going to say that she has experience because she was first lady? Because I think that's going to be a strange argument, and we haven't really heard that yet. I think
it's really hard. In one of the town meetings, they actually put on a question from my colleague Steve Clemens, which was kind of which was a total softball, of course, and she did it just fine. Which is, the question was, when you're president, will you be the kind of president who hears dissenting views and so forth? It welcomes alternate opinions or whatever. Obviously, with reference to the Bush administration, she said, yes, I do all those things. What I said to Steve was that I thought I wish she'd answered actually by making some reference to the fact that the Clinton administration, the Clinton White House, for all its chaos, was one in which, enormous different views battled their way out, and the president, it was okay to say something to the president that was different from what the guy before just said, and he could deal with hearing a bunch of different views, and it was, similar to FDR, it was that kind of White House. It was interesting. I think
herself as, because my husband did that, I'll be like that.
Well, I mean, she knows something about that. She's seen that. She's seen that. There's nobody who's seen how a White House works or doesn't work who's in this race.
I just have a little problem with the fact that in order to use that as a qualification, she has to say she was the wife of the president. To me...
Well, but the thing is, she couldn't say that. In answer to Steve, she couldn't say that because she can't actually... she can't push that button very hard. It has to be a subtle thing. So she couldn't give what I think would actually be the right and interesting answer to that question.
Well, I think
but
she's
I wish she
right
had, because
to
that's
resist saying that. I think she's clearly not talking about being the First Lady and having experienced vicariously through the president. I think she's right to do that.
Okay. Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's a. But you're basically charging her with doing that anyway.
I want her to.
You're basically
run
saying
for
the mere
president
fact that she's in the race is doing it.
themes that, by talking about issues that the president really has something to do with, and get off of these special women's topics, and stop talking about the mere fact that she's a woman, which is obvious. I think she needs to have some real substance and show that, despite the fact that she's a woman, that she can deal with these subjects that have normally been considered things that men are concerned with. She needs to demonstrate that. I just don't think... And the fact is, she was the First Lady. That's how we got to know her. And, there are just a lot of confusing... complex issues that people are trying to get their mind around the idea of a woman being president. But it's not just a woman, it's a specific person who we know a lot about. And and we're troubled by a lot of that. And she has a lot to overcome. Maybe she can do it, and it's true that she's been a senator for a while, which is all you can say about most of these other characters anyway.
Right. And I do think it's a remarkably poor preparation, in fact. Because you can kind of fake it for a while in the Senate if you want, but she's done an amazing job. She's done an amazing job with that.
What is this amazing job that she did as senator? I just don't know. What
she's
you're
built
about.
a lot. She's built a lot of good cross-party alliances.
Oh, she's done a good job in the political sense of running for president.
She's done a good job in the political sense of functioning as a good senator, of making something of that role. Both within and outside of the institution, and it's hard because it's some people when they're like we'll talk a little bit about Barack Obama in a minute. I mean, Barack Obama from day one operated more outside the Senate than inside the Senate, and that's fine. That's one thing you can do. It's actually
this might have something to do with why senators are always so unsuccessful in running for president. That they're about working with each other and political wrangling, and it doesn't play that well to the outside world.
Right. Well, political wrangling or political cooperation. I mean,
the skills of a senator don't seem to translate, or people don't think they translate very well into president. They keep not picking these people.
Yeah, right. Well, and I think that in just the very language that senators use when they, every sentence from a senator begins, I was among the first to co-sponsor such and such a thing, as opposed to somebody who's a governor, they can say, I put in place health care that covered all kids in my state, or something like that.
Unfortunately, this time we don't really... Well, if you look at the governors who are running, I mean, a question that I have is, let's assume it should be one of the governors, but which one? Are there really any governors you can get behind?
Right.
I just think it's kind of a lackluster field across the board, but I don't like anyone. But
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that even though there are more Democratic governors now than there were, more Democratic governors who have some record of success than there were, say, 4 or 8 years ago, when there were remarkably few. All of them have basically fallen by the wayside, except for Vilsack, and Bai counts as a governor because he's a former governor, and Warner dropped out. It's kind of surprising that we don't have that executive type. It's also why I think that is so clear cut now, especially after Kerry Edwards. We will never again have a 2-senator ticket.
You think not? People say Hillary Obama.
Well, I mean, I think that's a real barrier. I think that you shouldn't have a 2-senator ticket, and I think that will be a real limitation on a Clinton-Obama ticket. I mean, maybe. I mean, you just really, really want to have a governor in there. Well, Richardson is in, so we'll see what. We'll see what happens with that.
So, but let's bring Obama into this. You wanted to talk about the way he was smeared over this madrasa charge.
I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to talk about the article in the Times about his time at Harvard Law
Right.
School, and a couple of other things. Well, let's start with the Harvard Law School story, because this was I picked up the paper yesterday, and there's a picture of Barack Obama from Harvard in a T-shirt that says Harvey Gantt for Senate, from Harvey Gantt's 1988 race against Jesse Helms, and it says, this is Barack Obama in 1988 or 89, whatever, in the apartment of his friend Bradford Berenson. I was like, Bradford Berenson is like one of these Federalist Society guys, And then you read on, and it's really quite a fascinating story about how Obama became president of the Harvard Law Review. In part, there's some elaborate, skull and bones like ritual for doing this, but what ultimately happened was that the conservatives kind of felt he was one of the few that he would give him a fair shake.
Bradford Berenson said, whatever his politics, we felt he would give us a fair shake.
He would give us a fair shake, and it was to be reminded. I know a number of people who were at Harvard Law School at that time. Law schools in general, Harvard in particular. That was a high level ideological warfare at that time,
absolutely.
Almost like a taste of what we had of what was coming at the national level, between the emerging Federalist Society folks, the critical legal studies
I think the biggest
people at the
dispute was
time.
between the more traditional liberal types and the much more radical left-wing types who were critical legal studies and critical race theory. And I think
critical
if you
race theory, yeah.
A black student at that time, the appeal, or that it would be hard not to be drawn into a lot of the really flamboyant kind of critical race theory stuff that was going on there. It was very strong.
Right. And he wasn't, and managed to kind of, in the way that he now seems to be able to transcend certain things. He was able to move with some grace without losing his. He didn't give up any of his identity as essentially a liberal law student.
I like this quote from Harvard law professor Charles Ogletree that was in the Times article. He said, speaking of Barack Obama, he can enter your space and organize your thoughts without necessarily revealing his own concerns and conflicts. And I was thinking, it sounds like a superpower, He can enter your space and organize your thoughts. And you don't know anything about him. You have this feeling that he's doing something, but all he is doing is, affecting your mind and your thoughts, and you don't really know anything about him. And it's sort of like now he's doing this on the national stage. He's entered our space. He's organizing our thoughts. But we're really just projecting our hopes onto him, and he is skillfully making us do that. But we don't really know anything at all.
Well, you're making him sound a little Lex Luthor-like. I think that puts a very sinister cast on what, in fact, leaders and public figures do with language and with ideas.
Including the most sinister ones.
Sure. Well, the most sinister and the most gifted. And the most good. I don't think there's a reason to think that he's sort of operating by some kind of mind control here. He's just extraordinarily gifted.
That was someone who was really supporting him and trying to say something good about him. He obviously has that quality, and he himself has referred to that. He knows that he's doing that. And part of his skill is that he'll even talk about the fact that he's doing that. I admire his ability to do that. But at some point, you have to get beyond just the fact that he's making you feel good about your own values and ideals and things like that, and that he can make everybody feel good at the same time, and make everyone feel that things are going to be good. At some point, you don't just hand power to someone who's only doing that.
Now you're putting the same. You've written a lot about Obama and Al Sharpton and some of the traditional, some of his kind of complicated relationship with the traditional black leadership.
Well, I think
and with kind of the same read on him, right?
I think that they're in a special position of having occupied a niche for a long time, where their opinions were listened to, that they were sought out, that they could say things, and that Obama might just end up preempting them, where everyone now feels that, they're talking to this important black leader, and so why do we really have to put up with Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson anymore? And I do think that I sort of understand the way people like Jackson, and I don't know how well I understand them. I won't purport to totally understand them, but I think that they have reason to be afraid that their role is being preempted by someone else who actually isn't saying that much. Now, I mean, in some ways, maybe they've gotten more attention than they deserve, and they claim to speak for a lot of people. Maybe they don't speak for them. But I do think that they have at least done something that has been important, which is to make white Americans face up to things that are uncomfortable, and to be a little bit in your face toward people who would rather feel comfortable. And here's Obama, who is offering to make us feel comfortable, and so we don't have to listen to these things that have been disturbing us all these years, and isn't that nice? So, I mean, in a way, it's too easy for Obama to step into that role and make everybody feel good. Maybe we should be critical of ourselves for feeling so good about Barack Obama.
So you are taking the kind of Sharpton view of there's nothing there.
There might be some. No, I'm not. Yeah. I'm just saying. I think that. Well, we're inclined to like him in part because we want to like him because he's black and because he represents something that we want to care about. But he's making it easy for us because he doesn't talk about civil rights. He's not really talking about the underclass. You talked before about how nobody's talking about poverty. He is speaking in the same kind of generic, appeal to the middle, broad values sort of a way that Hillary Clinton is also trying to speak.
Right, except it's a hell of a lot more individualistic and less focus group tested. Let me comment on that. I want to talk about this.
In other words, he's playing the role more skillfully than she is.
Well, that may be.
But it's still that role.
Right. Now, it seems to me that this, for this point, we need to recognize that there's been a long evolution. I mean, there's a generational shift in black politics, right? And there's some resistance to this. So there's, Cory Booker running for mayor of Newark, losing once, winning a second time. There's been a ton of this going on in New York, and Sharpton has been, quite supportive of the old guard. So what happens in several of the congressional districts, city council races, and so forth, the sort of well-educated, person who's not steeped in the existing political machine comes in and challenges an incumbent or challenges the machine, and it becomes a very complicated class race conflict. And this has happened. I happen to have a sense of it in New York, Washington. Now we're on our second mayor who actually represents that new generation of black politics in the form of Adrian Fenty and his predecessor Anthony Williams, but other places. So Sharpton's resistance to Obama fits into this context of kind of an established black politics that resists this broader the appeal for people who actually have a broader sense. Now, often, I think what you're writing about this is missed is that often that next generation is in many ways more liberal than the black establishment. In many ways has become kind of conservative. Sharpton is not, but a lot of the people he's supporting in New York, say, have actually been much more conservative outside of both on race matters and on other issues, and the people who are challenging them are actually more basically ideologically liberal. So I don't think it's I don't think it's that they stand for nothing. And then the other thing I want to say is somebody emailed me this morning, and I just read it quickly over lunch, an article called "What Makes Obama Run," which is a very good article, and the date is December 8th, 1995. So it's interesting to have read this side by side with the Harvard Law School article. And it's about Obama at the time of his first Senate race his first race for state Senate in 95 or 96. And his background as a community organizer, and it's really wonderful. And he talks a lot about how he, in this article, and we'll put a link to it on the side here, it's from the Chicago Reader, he talks a lot about how he thinks too much was invested in politics of single charismatic leaders, particularly at that time Harold Washington, who really, really transformed Chicago politics, and and he's basically arguing that, that Washington, he says Washington was the classic charismatic leader, but when he died, all of that dissipated. There was he says, this potentially powerful collective spirit that went into supporting him was never translated into clear principles or into an articulable agenda for community change. And he talks a lot about how a lot of the preachers in Chicago, they're good at getting people fired up, but they don't have ways of channeling that into real politics, and how he's kind of reached the conclusion, coming out of community organizing, that electoral politics is where you do this. And the language is not any different from the language he uses now. And it's very substantive, and it's a very clear vision, and it comes out of a real, very specific dissatisfaction with the experience of black politics, both in the Harold Washington, moment of positive change that flames out, and the sort of Sharpton politics of protest kind of thing. And he manages to be sharply critical of both, while kind of using language eloquently enough to really paint an alternative. It'll be interesting to. I encourage you to read this article, and then maybe we come back to this.
Put the link up in the sidebar here.
Well, I'll put the link up because I just see this in a much more positive, light.
I'm really not intending to be negative about Obama. I just feel that we should be a little just in terms of race politics, that white people should be a little self-critical about what we go for. We can be a little self-complimentary that we like a black candidate, but not critical about why we like him. And we may like him because he's actually he's flattering us and giving us a chance to feel good about ourselves. And I don't think that in itself is enough. But I assume that he'll become more substantial as the days wear on, and he'll be forced into it. But he's done a great job so far. But what about this Madrasa thing?
Well, I just thought it was interesting. I have the New York Times had a good article this morning about the whole background behind the smear that he had attended an Islamic madrasa when he lived in Indonesia as a young boy, and of course it was completely made up and comes from what remains of the Mooney Insight magazine, which I didn't even know had disappeared, and it seems to be a one-man website now, which then got fed into Fox News, and so it was an interesting analysis of the smear machine. But what was impressive to me was how incredibly forcefully Obama pushed back on this. He did this long letter to Fox News and released it everywhere about, that not only saying this is dishonest and I'm disappointed that Fox News would stoop to this level, but really going after them hard, and that was well received in the liberal blogosphere, for example. And it made me think that in the way that we all remember when Bill Clinton went after the rapper Sister Souljah in 1992, and that became a kind of verb. So the way you validated yourself as a Democrat back in the early 90s was, to sort of take on and push back hard on the extremist elements of your own party, your own coalition. And it seems to me that the way you do that now is actually to show that you can push back hard on the extremist elements of the right.
Political candidates always fight their opponents. What Bill Clinton did that was striking was that he hit to the left of him rather than to the opposite side. I mean, we expect candidates to fight their opponents.
Well, but this is also fighting the media. I mean, no Democrat has been willing to say Fox News is a scam. Fox News takes crackpot emails from whatever remains of Insight magazine and calls them news. No Democrat has been able to stand up against those aspects of the opposition that kind of hide behind the label of being media.
Well, yeah. Well, I think he was also obviously remembering what happened to John Kerry with the Swift boat veterans. The idea that if you think things are too small, that they're beneath you to respond to Insight magazine or whatever. You're saying, well, the problem was that it got repeated on Fox News, but I think that there's a larger problem, which is just something gets going in the blogosphere or online, and there's this viral way in which these stories break out, there's a certain kind of nourishment that the blogosphere needs every day, and things are going to play out in a different way this time, and they need to watch. They need to nip these things in the bud, because something that's juicy goes viral, and then I think Obama has to especially worry about just the way in which little insinuations will start to make people just instinctively feel averse to him. This sense that, he's a foreigner, there's something different about him that ought to make us uneasy. There are a lot of people who will be affected by things like that without even consciously noticing that's what's making them feel a little odd or suspicious. And this interest in getting out the kinds of things that will touch off that kind of prejudice is really out there.
Right. Well, it'll be an interesting test. I mean, on the one hand, you're saying that Barack Obama plays into white people's desire not to feel racist because they can feel like this is a white candidate I like, and he's not a black candidate I like, and he's not like those other black people. Right. On the other hand, you can create this whole other.
He's also vulnerable.
He's also vulnerable, but not in a way, not on the basis of blackness, on the basis of some other thing that is, of course, related to the fact that you've never seen anybody
can be stirred up against him too. Similar to what I was saying about Hillary Clinton, you can cause people to be interested in you and even to love you and get excited about you by being a woman or by being a black person. But at the same time, people have the ability to become prejudiced about you too, and your opponents are going to find opportunities to get away with stirring up that prejudice. I mean, it'll backfire on them if they do it wrong, but you can have these marginal groups that are out there essentially playing the swift boat role. And not to say whether the swift boat people were wrong or right about some of their accusations, but you can get.
Well, let's just say they were wrong.
Oh, I don't want to. I'm not going to.
Okay. Well,
I just don't want to even go. I'm not going to go there. But I mean, the thing is, you could have a group bring up certain charges, and they need to be dealt with, and they may just bring up old prejudices about the person. I mean, obviously with Kerry, there was an ability to bring up the idea that he was not quite patriotic, that he really hurt soldiers back during the Vietnam War era by making insinuations that weren't true. And it doesn't matter exactly how you get the doubts stirred up, but you can get them going, and the candidate may never recover. And he has to figure out a way to notice what are the viral memes out there that are a stir and causing people to flip and become suspicious. And I think both Hillary and Obama are vulnerable to that, even as they're also taking advantage of their differentness to make people feel positive feelings. They're also vulnerable to the negative feelings that their opponents are going to have a motive to stir up.
Right. And I guess all I'm saying is not only is all that true, that you have to deal with this in a certain way, but that I think for Democratic voters, it's a very important credential at this point is to show that you are willing and able to, stand up to that when it's time to stand up to that. And that people are going to be watching for that. And you don't quite see Hillary Clinton do it quite the same way, although maybe she doesn't have to because she.
I don't like to hear too much belly aching about Fox News, though. I mean, I think specifically going after this smear was important, but I think this idea of talking about how Fox News is biased or something like that, I don't think that's a very good issue.
No, but I think they need to be. I think you need to push back on Fox News when they do something like this. I don't think a general,
but I think the general charge that Fox News is prejudiced is not really very helpful.
It's probably not, whether it's true or it's like with Swiss vote, whether it's true or not. It's probably not that. It's probably not that helpful, and it leads you into that territory that says, well, if only people got their news from NPR, they'd think the right things, as opposed to all those people who get their news from Fox News. Of course, that's all actually demonstrably true. That, for example, there was a study showing that people who, that tested sort of 7 incorrect beliefs about Iraq, like Al-Qaeda, Saddam links, and so forth, and broke it down by where people got their news, and people who got their news from Fox News believed all 7 of the incorrect things.
Yeah, but, correlation is not causation. I think people are watching Fox News in the first place because they have that general
Right.
they
But
have
these
a
were
general
factual.
leaning, so they feel more comfortable watching that. They're just
Well, that's right, but then it gets reinforced not just with opinion, but with actual facts that are not true, and in this case, I think there's certainly some level of causation. There's one other thing while we're on the Obama topic.
Yeah.
This might be a little abstract, and we might be we're almost at an hour, so we might be be running out of time. But I'm really interested in this idea, and this goes back to the law school article. It seems to me, and you might have a lot to say at this as somebody who really identifies yourself as a centrist. It seems to me there's an interesting choice between people who are sort of meet in the middle centrists. Joe Lieberman meets, I don't know, Olympia Snow kind of centrism. The most conservative liberals meet up with the most liberal Republicans or conservatives. It's sort of the traditional way you do things. And Obama's approach, which I'm actually very sympathetic to, which is you come from some place clearly. You're rooted in a certain kind of liberalism and a certain kind of social vision. But you actually have this extraordinary respect, not just for the people who are closest to you on the other side, but for the underlying assumptions of conservative philosophy, that you treat them, that whole concept of he would treat the conservatives fairly. It's almost like a whole different conception of how you do centrism. And one that actually has a lot of power to it. I don't know. Do you have any?
Yeah, I think that's a good
more to
point.
say
It's
than
sort
that.
of like instead of just trying to find the center and adopt the substantive policies that are right in the middle, that's the Bill Clinton approach. What
Right.
you do is actually stay on your side. So you're a liberal and you actually have liberal policies, but you bridge over the center by just the sort of the rhetoric and the attitude, so that you show respect for people who have traditional values. And so,
Right.
for example, you could be for gay marriage without acting like the people on the other side are bigots. So you can reach over to them, you can be sympathetic to them, you can show them
Right.
that you think they're good people, but you don't move your position.
Right. Or you can also sort of take certain aspects of, say, a conservative critique and absorb them into your, show how you're absorbing them into your philosophy, like a critique of regulation, for example. So you say we're going to look for this. We're going to try to achieve the same social goals, but we're going to take some of these points that are raised, say, by libertarians about regulation. We're going to incorporate. We're going to take the critique that we think is a correct critique and bring it to bear to actually improve and sharpen our own thinking on these issues.
Yeah.
As a kind of different
Yeah,
kind of
that's
centrism.
I like that. I think that's an important thing to watch, and I think that could be. I'd like to see liberals be a little less nasty to the people on the other side. I often just put off by liberals just because they have a tendency to think they're good and the other people are bad, and to just be a little too nasty about it.
Yeah.
But you don't have to become lukewarm on the substance in order to avoid that. In fact, it just would be politically wise.
Right.
Hey,
right.
so are we running out of time, or do you want to talk about the peace marches and nutritionism?
I've got about 5 or 6 minutes. So why don't we start with one of those, and if we can talk a little bit about both of them, that'd be great.
Okay, well,
'Cause you wanted to talk about the peace marches, and I don't really know what you wanted to say about them.
no, I don't really.
So,
I just took a little video. I was walking down the street in Madison, and I ran into the Madison Peace March, and I took a little video clip of it. I don't know how many people were there, maybe 100 people or so. And I got all the signs and the puppets and things like that. And but what upset me about my local crowd was, at the very front of the march, right behind the initial people who were holding the banners, was a guy with a sign that said "Viva Saddam."
right.
That doesn't
Do you think
make
that
a good
represents?
impression. I mean, I know that
It doesn't make a good impression, but
you're going to say you don't really want to hang out with those people. I think that there's a real problem with protesting today, that the sort of people who are, vigorously being the protest, like that guy, are very off-putting to ordinary people. In fact, like the parade, the march in general, looked like it was just a general peace march. It was people who were really hardcore pacifists who are just generally for peace, as opposed to the more mainstream view, which would be opposition to the war in Iraq, and specifically about Iraq and wanting this war
Right.
to end. And I think
right.
that that's a more generally held view. But the people who come out in March are people who seem like throwbacks to a former era, and who are saying just very hardcore things about peace. And you know, I think I can see why ordinary people aren't showing up in numbers, maybe because they really don't go along with that view. And I think that's what you were saying, right?
Well, I mean, I think there's a little of that. I mean, I didn't go. We had friends come down from New York for the march here. My family went. I didn't go. Partly, I mean, I had some other things I had to do. But you know, when you do something like that, yeah, there is a little bit of an aversion to some of the folks. But at the same time, you have to remember, I mean, there's no reason. It's only because this whole business of marching has become just so ritualized.
Yeah.
And yes, it draws. It's not so much that it draws pacifists, in my view, you know, but that it just sort of draws every LaRoucheite and this cause or that cause. And you know, it's ridiculous to feel that way. In fact, it is one way. I should have marched. It is a good way of expressing a viewpoint. If I express my viewpoint that the war in Iraq was a mistake and should end, I don't have to endorse anybody else's viewpoint who happens to show up at the same place. And I don't for a second think that there's any.
You wouldn't want to march behind the Viva Saddam sign, would you?
No, I'm not going to march behind a Viva Saddam sign, but I also don't have any belief that there's. I mean, the reason you bring that up, and the reason it's an obvious, thing is an obvious black mark, is because there is nobody in this country who believes that. I mean, it is a tiny percentage of all the 70% of people strongly oppose this war. So what percentage of that 70% would want to march behind a Viva Saddam
Well, I
sign?
wouldn't think that anybody would. So I was a little shocked to see him surrounded by people who were accepting that he was carrying a sign like that. I find that very disturbing. But, I mean, back in the Vietnam days, the idea of showing up for a big protest, it was a big cultural, social thing. And the fact that lots of wild, challenging things were being said, it was part of the whole ethos. It was part of the whole fun of doing it.
Right.
It
was your classic baby boomer ecstatic experience.
Yeah. And so now there's some people who are still trying to relive those days. And
That's right.
who are people who are just sensibly against the war, if that's their position. They're not, like, warming up to the whole environment of that, and so you're not rushing out. You feel guilty that you didn't go, maybe, but back in the Vietnam era, it was we want to go, we want to do this. This is the happening place where people of my generation are being young and it's an exciting place to go, as opposed to an obligation and a sort of a grim duty.
Well, yeah, absolutely, and that's a significant sort of generational difference. It also has to do, by the way, with the fact that, I mean, though the Vietnam protests were kind of always on the edge of Chicago '68 style kind of complete social breakdown, because the man didn't know how to deal with them, and now the man knows how to deal with them. It's the most sort of time-honored ritual. You call them up and you say, we're going to have 300,000 people, you need this, you need that. I mean, I remember my wife used to cover these protests in Washington about an environmental issue, and they would come and they would chain themselves to the axle of a truck in front of the White House, but they would call up the D.C. police and say, okay, we're going to chain ourselves to the axle of a truck. It's going to take you 3 hours to get through the chains, and they would do it. But it's so formalized, and the police know better than to go crazy the way they did in Chicago in '68. There's a sort of ritual for all sides. You never kind of cross that line.
Everybody knows they're on TV now.
Everybody knows they're on TV. It's these are the things you do. It's kind of obligatory, and so it's never going to be the ecstatic experience of the Vietnam era.
Yeah.
And you just have to get that by voting for
Also, the young people are sick of us boomers, and the idea of going and engaging in the spirit of the boomer can't be that attractive to most people.
There is, I have to say, a little of that I think going on. And it's like, you had your riots, we have our blogs.
Well, that's another thing.
You have the wonderful experience of having your riots and having your blog.
A lot of people, because of the internet, they feel like they can stay home and look at their computer and being politically active. It looks exactly the same as playing a video game, and you don't really have to go anywhere. It's all happening online. But then there are no images on TV showing everybody hunched over their computer in a different room.
I think that's right. And then there's and there's less drugs, less sex, and all that.
Hey, did we run out of time, or do you want to?
We ran out of. I think we are just about out of time.
So you want to scrap nutritionism, or? We need a light topic. We've been all...
We do need a light topic. Well, why don't we just link to that interesting Michael Pollan article? I agreed with. I don't think we have enough.
We're dribbling out at the end. That's not good. We need to end with a...
All right, let's talk about nutrition.
Okay, well, there was a nice article in the New York Times Magazine yesterday by Michael Pollan, who wrote about basically this idea of the ideology of nutrition that's replaced actually eating food, and that we've really sort of lost our minds and become ridiculous and obese and everything else over the years since I thought what was interesting about it and political was that he pinpoints the problem in 1977 when a Senate Select Committee on Nutrition led by George McGovern put out a report telling people to cut down on red meat and dairy products and got a lot of pushback from the red meat and dairy industry and withdrew the report and replaced it with something saying choose meats, poultry, and fish that will reduce saturated fat intake.
Right.
And so it became this focus on the nutrient rather than on the type of food, and there was no... And the idea that you should eat less was also removed. I don't know, this is giving a lot of credit to the government to influence us, but apparently this is the start of this idea that instead of thinking of ourselves as eating food, we'd be thinking of ourselves as eating nutrition, and the whole idea that we should eat less of it just went by the wayside, and now the idea was consume nutrients. And that just kind of made us crazy and fat. And it was all because George McGovern didn't have the stamina to stand up to the red meat and dairy industry.
It was all George McGovern's fault. Well, I mean, it was better than it was better than nothing. I thought it was a wonderful article, totally worth reading. It always reminded me of my mother-in-law's advice, which is never eat a pound of anything. It's absolutely. It seems to be absolutely true that you just you should eat good foods, a good mix of them, and all that. I just read over the Christmas break. I read this book called "The United States of Arugula" by David Kemp, which is kind of about the culinary revolution in America from Julia Child and James Beard, and then Alice Waters, Chez Panisse, and so forth. Reading the Michael Pollan article and having read the United States of Arugula, it was a reminder that in the 1970s, the idea of eat a variety of fresh foods and things like that was harder advice to give than it is now. I mean, our cuisine was a lot narrower then than it is now, and the great section of that book really kind of gets going when it gets into the middle section and the culture around Chez Panisse restaurant in California, in Berkeley. Where which is where the sort of the cult of eat fresh local ingredients comes from, and people would come to the door of the restaurant with their whatever they'd grown in their garden, and they would be worked into some kind of ingredient. There's a great, just to go back to the Vietnam era, and then we can wrap this up to link these two things together. There's a great anecdote in there where about Alice Waters, the founder of Chez Panisse, and her and all of them came out of the Berkeley Free Speech movement. And that they would have these dinners, and her boyfriend at the time would insist that before she opened the restaurant, they would have these fancy dinners at their commune or whatever people lived in those days. And before every dinner, he would say, "Now I want everybody to recognize that there's more protein in this chocolate mousse than the average Vietnamese gets in a year, and you can't eat this unless you at least know this fact." So the links between food politics and radical politics are to be found in this other book.
Another link that I would make is I think that the effort now is to blame the government or see the government as the cure for everything, and it's sort of like, oh, it's the Senate or George McGovern's fault that we stopped eating properly and we're fat, and the law. Oh,
we got to wrap this up, but I got a whole different angle on that.
Let me just say my one thing is that I think that the fault that they don't want to say, the one thing they don't want to say, to get back to the feminism issue, is they don't want to say the problem was the women's movement. Women went to work and they stopped cooking dinners from scratch, and so we all started eating processed food and fast food, and it's not because of the companies and it's not because of the government. It's because women stopped serving everyone so well.
Well, but you could also say, I was going to make a totally different point, but you could also say it's the fault of an economy that requires more time out of everybody's lives, and nobody has the time to be cooking dinner. I'm not. I'd rather go back to issue 1 than to bash feminism, because we were very good. We were very good feminists today.
I'm all for women not serving. So, but I do think that some of the problem that we need to take responsibility for is that women aren't cooking dinners anymore.
Well, I got to go
Okay.
pick up my daughter and cook dinner so my wife can go
Okay.
out. So maybe if I can get my bona fides on that front. Okay.
Good food. Eat arugula.
Thanks. You too. Nice talking to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.